December 17, 1944. A snow-covered field 3 kilometers southwest of Aachen, Germany, Technical Sergeant Robert Herron of the 991st Field Artillery Battalion crouched behind the cold steel hull of his M12 gun motor carriage and checked his watch. 42 seconds had passed since the last round left the barrel of the massive 155 mm gun behind him. The crew worked with machine-like precision, closing the earth spade, securing the breech, the driver igniting the Continental radial engine. Herron knew what came next. Somewhere to the east, German sound-ranging equipment had already triangulated their position the moment the gun fired. Counter-battery fire was inevitable. The mathematics were simple and merciless. They had a minute, maybe less, before high-explosive shells began raining. Down on this exact spot, the M12 had just fired from a position nearly 18,000 meters behind the front lines. Its shell, 95 pounds of steel and explosives, had arced through the frozen December sky at over 700 meters per second, striking a German artillery position that forward observers had marked 20 minutes earlier. Flight time, 45 seconds. By the time the shell hit, Herron's crew was supposed to be gone. This was the brutal calculus of modern artillery warfare. Fire, relocate, survive, hesitate, and you die. The M12 gun motor carriage was a paradox of American engineering. It married a First World War-era French 155mm GPF gun to the chassis of an obsolete M3 Grant medium tank. The result? A weapon capable of unleashing one of the heaviest shells in the U.S. arsenal, from distances so extreme the enemy could barely hear it, let alone see it. Its shells could pulverize 7 feet of reinforced concrete, or destroy Tiger tanks from beyond their effective range. It could strike 12 miles across the battlefield, smashing ammunition depots, command posts, and enemy gun batteries with surgical precision. But range wasn't its greatest strength. Mobility was. A towed artillery gun of the same caliber needed 3 hours to fire. Pack up and move 6 miles to safety. The M12 could do the same in 35 minutes. That difference, measured in minutes, meant life or death. German counter-battery doctrine in 1944 was deadly efficient, using sound-ranging microphones and flash-spotting posts. They could pinpoint an artillery position within 2 to 4 minutes of its first shot. Veteran. German officers could then return fire. Within 5 to 7 minutes, a towed gun crew would still be limbering up. An M12 crew would already be gone. The irony was grim. American planners had initially rejected the M12 as unnecessary. By late 1943, the Army ground forces declared it obsolete, too expensive, too complex, using a tank chassis already outdated. Only 100 had been built between 1942 and 1943. Most were mothballed, sent to training grounds or left in depots gathering dust. Doctrine at the time favored towed artillery, stable, reliable, and entrenched. The logic was sound. Dig in, fortify, and protect your guns. But the Western Front in December 1944 shattered that logic. 6 months after the Normandy landings, the Allies had fought their way across France at staggering cost. The Wehrmacht had retreated, but not broken. Now they defended their homeland with a desperation born of inevitability. The Siegfried Line, Germany's so-called West Wall, stretched for hundreds of miles, a fortress of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and interlocking artillery zones. This was a war dominated by artillery. More soldiers died to shells than to bullets or bombs. The gun, not the rifle, not the tank, not the plane, was the king of battle. Artillery could flatten fortifications, silence enemy batteries, and shatter infantry assaults before they began. The side that controlled artillery controlled the battlefield. The side that lost it lost the war. American doctrine emphasized mass fires and rapid response forward observers with frontline. Infantry could call for support and receive rounds within 3 to 6 minutes, multiple. Batteries could coordinate time on target fire. Missions, dozens of guns firing from different ranges so that hundreds of shells arrived. Simultaneously, it was devastating. German troops came to fear American artillery more than any other weapon. It killed more of them than infantry ever could, but the Americans had a weakness. The Germans had mastered counter-battery warfare, an art that could turn an American battery into a crater within minutes. Sound-ranging arrays could hear everything. Microphones spread over kilometers detected. The subtle time delays between a gun's report, allowing triangulation accurate to within 100 meters, fog, darkness, or terrain didn't matter. The microphones always heard. Flash spotting teams worked at night, marking the direction of every muzzle flash, combining bearings until a firing position was exposed. A battery that stayed in one spot too long would be found and erased. Under ideal conditions, it took 5 to 8 minutes from the first American shot to the first German shell impact, sometimes 10 or 12. But the response always came. U.S. doctrine stressed defense. Dig in, build berms, protect your guns. Artillery was expensive. Crews were irreplaceable, ammunition scarce. Losing guns meant losing firepower, so they built static defenses, convinced that protection equaled survival. They were wrong. The few American self-propelled guns before 1944, like the M7 Priest, were designed to move with tanks, not to fight long-range artillery duels. Heavier self-propelled guns were rare, dismissed as luxuries. Until the Ordnance Department, back in 1941, proposed a radical idea, mounting a heavy gun on a tank chassis. The prototype, designated T6, was tested in February 1942 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. It fired, moved 6 miles, fired again, all within 35 minutes. A towed gun needed 3 hours. But the Army ground forces remained skeptical. They believed conventional artillery was good enough. Still, 100 M12s were built, then parked, forgotten, and nearly scrapped. A solution, it seemed. Without a problem, that would change within a year. Because by December 1943, as planning began for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the U.S. Army would rediscover the M12, and soon, it would prove to be one of the most decisive artillery weapons of the war. By September 1944, artillery officers across the European theater began comparing casualty reports between units equipped with M12, gun motor carriages, and those still operating towed 155mm guns. The results were unmistakable and alarming. Battalions using towed artillery were suffering casualties from German counter-battery fire 3 to 4 times, higher than their M12-equipped counterparts. The reason was simple. German counter-battery doctrine worked. Their sound-ranging and flash-spotting systems were brutally efficient. Within minutes of an American gun firing, German artillery could triangulate its position and rain shells down with deadly precision. The only guns that survived were the ones that moved. Captain James Benson, a forward observer with the 987th Field Artillery Battalion, explained it best in a letter home, October 1944. The Germans are very good at finding our guns. They have listening devices that pick up our fire and calculate where we are. Within 5 or 6 minutes, shells start falling on our last position, but by then, we're gone. The M12 fires. We pull the spade, start the engine, and move before the German rounds ever land. The men with towed guns dig holes and pray. We just drive away. In early September 1944, the 991st Field Artillery Battalion, operating with the 3rd Armored Division during the drive toward Aachen, earned a special distinction. It became the first American artillery unit on the Western Front to fire on German soil. Their target, a road junction near Bilstein, southwest of Aachen, nearly 19,800 yards, or 11.14 miles away. They fired from inside Belgium, displaced, and then crossed the German border, continuing the attack while enemy counter-battery fire fell harmlessly on empty ground. German attempts to destroy the battery failed. The M12s were moving targets, and moving targets are hard to kill. Between September and December 1944, the 5 M12 battalions fired over 150,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition, conducting counter-battery missions, destroying fortifications, interdicting supply routes, and providing direct fire support for advancing infantry and armor. After-action reports told the story clearly. The M12 units faced breakdowns, supply shortages, and occasional close assaults, but minimal losses to enemy. Artillery mobility was keeping the crews alive. The M12's greatest test came during the German Ardennes offensive, the battle. of the Bulge. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split Allied lines and seize Antwerp. The initial success was devastating. American divisions were surrounded, overrun, or forced into retreat. For towed artillery units, this created a nightmare choice: stand and fight from fixed positions, or abandon their guns and fall. Back, many stood and were annihilated. Dozens of American guns were captured intact in the opening days of the offensive, but the M12 battalions faced no such dilemma. They could fight and move. The 557th and 558th Field Artillery battalions provided covering fire for retreating American infantry, then displaced westward, re-established firing positions, engaged the advancing enemy again, and withdrew once more. They repeated the process for days. Not a single M12 was captured during the entire Ardennes campaign. The Germans simply couldn't catch them. By late December 1944, as Allied forces stabilized the front and prepared to counterattack, artillery officers across Europe began urgently requesting more M12s, or any equivalent self-propelled heavy artillery. The lesson was now carved in steel and blood. Static artillery doctrine meant death. Mobile doctrine meant survival. This wasn't theory. It was measured in bodies and broken guns. Through the final months of the war, the M12 served with distinction across every major American offensive, from the Ardennes counterattack in January 1945 to the Rhine crossing in March, and the final advance into Germany by April and May. On May 7, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender, the 991st Battalion fired its final counter-battery mission, silencing enemy guns defending a bridge over the Elbe River. When the echoes faded, the war was over. According to U.S. Army Ordnance Department records, the 74 M12s deployed to Europe fired more than 250,000 rounds in 11 months of combat, averaging 3,300 rounds per vehicle, despite each carrying only 10 rounds internally. This relentless pace proved that mobile heavy artillery wasn't just viable, it was superior. Despite being built on the outdated M3 Grant chassis, powered by Continental radial engines and designed with pre-war components, the M12 maintained an operational readiness rate above 75%, rivaling modern self-propelled systems. Most failures stemmed not from poor design, but from the brutal stress of firing such a massive gun repeatedly. The chassis held. The system endured. Combat losses told the rest of the story. Of 74 M12s sent to Europe, only 2 were destroyed by enemy action. Both were overrun. In the first days of the Ardennes offensive, their crews escaped. Not a single M12 was ever destroyed by German counter-battery fire for heavy artillery. This was unheard of. M12 battalions suffered fewer than 50 men killed during the entire European campaign, most in direct assaults, not artillery duels. Meanwhile, towed gun crews in the same theater faced casualty rates 3 to 4 times higher. The difference came down to one factor. Mobility crews that could move survived, crews that couldn't died. The U.S. Army recognized this truth immediately. After-action reports, training bulletins, and doctrinal revisions from Fort Sill all echoed the same conclusion. Shoot, move, survive. Self-propelled heavy artillery capable of shoot and scoot operations possessed decisive tactical advantages wherever the enemy had effective counter-battery capability. That principle would shape American and global artillery doctrine for decades. M12 proved something far greater than its design suggested. It showed that mobility wasn't just offensive power. It was survival itself. In any weapon system that reveals its position, through fire, artillery, mortars, rockets, missiles, the ability to disappear was the only true defense. This revelation, first proven by the M12 in 1944 and 1945, became a foundational law of modern warfare. When the war ended in May 1945, U.S. Army evaluators gave the M12 high marks for combat effectiveness and simultaneously declared it obsolete. It was a paradox that perfectly captured the weapon's legacy. The M12 had proven the concept of mobile heavy artillery, but its body was temporary, built from outdated parts and a recycled World War I gun. It wasn't meant to last. It was meant to prove a point, and it did. Its successor, the M40 gun motor carriage, mounted the newer 150mm M1 long, Tom on a Sherman chassis, a purpose-built evolution of everything the M12 had learned in blood and fire. The 45. Seconds referenced in this story's title marks the time it took for an M12 shell to reach its maximum range target, roughly 12 miles away. During those 45 seconds, the projectile screamed through the air at supersonic velocity, carrying 95 pounds of high explosive toward an unseen enemy. At the same time, German listening stations were already tracking the sound, calculating coordinates, and preparing counter-battery fire. The race was on, between flight time and death. The M12's crews knew they had, perhaps a minute before enemy shells found their mark. Every second mattered. Speed wasn't luxury, it was life. Individually, the M12's components were unremarkable. A 26-ton chassis, a 24 mph top speed, an 18,000-meter maximum range, but together, they formed a weapon system that could strike, survive, and move faster than the enemy could react. That combination, speed, range, and mobility, redefined heavy artillery forever. The cost of learning that truth was paid by hundreds of artillerymen who fought and died beside towed guns that couldn't move. Their courage was unquestionable, but courage could not replace mobility. The M12 gun motor carriage may occupy only a small space in military history, overshadowed by tanks, bombers, and grand offensives, but its legacy endures. It proved a fundamental truth of modern war. The side that can strike and move lives, the side that must stand and fight dies. From artillery to aircraft, from rockets to missiles, that lesson echoes still. Today, the preserved M12 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma stands silent. Visitors see its massive gun, its open crew compartment, its spade, its worn tracks. But what they cannot see is the true genius of the machine, its ability to appear, strike, and vanish before the enemy could answer. That single ability, demonstrated by just 74 vehicles and 600 men over 11 months of war, reshaped American doctrine and saved countless lives in the decades to come. The M12 gun motor carriage, the weapon that turned survival into science.